And as I mentioned, our guest today is Lara Rae. So happy to have you here
Thank you.
today, Lara. Lara is a beloved comedy veteran. She is co-founder of the Winnipeg Comedy Fest and a university instructor. Lara was also a co-developer of Little Mosque on the Prairie. She has an honorary doctorate in letters from the University of Manitoba for her commitment to literature, arts, and culture, and also for her social work and activism.
I became interested in comedy. I think, like a lot of people who grow up in a kind of insecure and troubled environment, it's a form of escape. I would say that I wasn't traditionally the class clown, but I was certainly somebody that would tell somebody who was braver than me to do something funny. And then they would do it and they would get in trouble, but I would enjoy that. I think that was I was the second banana. Even at a very early age. But I mean, I became fascinated by comedy as a child. I grew up in Glasgow and, on the two Ronnies and Monty Python and very much that British style of humor, which I would say I still lean into and admire. Then when I moved to Canada, I continued, and then I fell into the world of stand-up to some degree accidentally because I was already doing sketches with another classmate, and then we became a comedy team, and we were around for the comedy boom in the 80s, traveling all over North America and Europe. And then, of course, I started the comedy festival and continued to book and produce comedy on television shows and so on. And so, as a fan of comedy and performer of comedy, I was able to amass a great deal of um, information, in terms of watching comedy, studying comedy, learning the history of comedy, and interviewing people who I think are significant in any discussion about comedy and speech and censorship and, punching up and punching down and so on, including Tommy Smothers, whose show along with his brothers Dick, the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour, was canceled by the American government in 1968 for being so severe on the government as related to the Vietnam War. And they were canceled, like Jimmy Kimmel, with a notable exception. And I think it's an important one because we see with Jimmy Kimmel a demonstration of censorship under capitalism, which is basically that if there's enough money on the side of the public wanting the thing that's been canceled, they will revive it. And so in this particular case, however, the Smothers Brothers, and people forget this, were number one in their time slot, the most popular show in America on a Sunday night. Their trick was very clever. They dressed like collegiate wags in their button-down sweaters and little ties, and Dickie had the bass and Tommy had the brush cut, but they said things that hippies said. They would do jokes. One of the jokes that I think probably began leaning towards cancellation was when they were talking about President Johnson, who was in at the time. This is before Nixon. President Johnson was looking at ways to encourage people to travel within the United States of America, to return to going from state to state and celebrating their own country. And then Tommy says, "What do you think the president can do to make people more interested in traveling around and visiting the country?" And Tommy says he could resign. And it's a pretty soft joke by our standards, but that began talks at the upper level of the administration. And they contacted CBS, who are always famously the most conservative and most quick to roll over network in US history. And they canceled the show. It was replaced, as you probably know, by a new show that became popular, which was on another network, which was Laugh-In, that was published by and produced by George Slaughter, somebody I've worked with over the years. And such was the reversal that you may remember that Nixon himself pops out of one of the Laugh-In windows and says, "Sock it to me." And so this idea of politicians influencing and being involved in entertainment and then entertainment then being involved in politics, and politics becoming entertainment, begin with the creation first of radio and certainly more powerfully television. And so a lot of the trends we're seeing now, like most things that change in public or culture, that seem immediate, they began earlier and they've rolled out over time. One of the significant changes in terms of what you can say and not say as a comedian, especially on television in the United States, is that the FCC, as you probably know, and the CRTC in Canada control the airwaves, so to speak. So they have a series of regulations about what you can say and not say on what basically is a government run communications network. With the advent of what used to be called cable, HBO, and so on, as you probably may or may not know, the FCC has no control over it. And of course, they have no control over the second biggest change in disseminating information in a semi open society, which is the internet, which also has no global boundaries. And so this allowed people to actually say things that were quite resistant, and develop their own followings in a kind of a balkanized way. People would create their own followings and their own crowds. And one of the highlights, and I think the good things about identity politics is, and the internet, is you can find something that you like. And for all their problems, and there are many, one of the things I would say that Netflix does kind of manage to do is they can put on display a tremendous number of choices in terms of what kind of ideologically suitable public entertainment you want to watch. In other words, you can watch Hannah Gatsby, and she's very trans positive and talks about autism and so on. And she seems free to say whatever she wants about Ted Sorensen, who runs Netflix, and that she doesn't like working for Netflix and so on. And they tolerate it, which gives a veneer of her being allowed to say whatever she wants. At the same time, she has no control over whether or not they put on people like Dave Chappelle, who are then, putting forward extremely offensive material about trans people. And so you create in the United States, very obviously, this false marketplace of ideas, both within comedy and within society. And then you realize over time, and as the older you get, you seem to be seeing the same people, the same ideas, and the same jokes. And no matter how edgy or dark they get, or how edgy the political opinion seems to be, and how mad people are going to be, if they hear it and so on, there are already self-censorship mechanisms in place. And turning to manufacturing consent by Noam Chomsky, you probably have a good understanding of how self-censorship under capitalism is the way that mostly you control the narrative, unless you're unhinged, like Donald Trump, and then you're reacting to things in an emotional way, a very Stalin, not Stalinistic, but a literally personality-wise, a Stalin-like way, where you are personally offended and have daily changing grievances over everybody, and then you just create a kind of a state of paranoia and chaos where people just don't say anything, But then even then, jokes exist, and so back in the day of Stalin, a guy goes to the newsstand and he's looking at all the papers, on the front page of the headlines, and the news vendor, because everybody's suspicious, he says, what are you doing? And he says, I'm looking for the obituaries. He says, the obituaries on the back page. And he says, not the one I'm looking for. And so these are the kind of jokes that you coy get away with. So some people put your hand up if you don't understand the joke. So everyone gets the joke. Okay, good. So these types of ideas, there's another similar joke. And again, they're cookie cutter. You can put in whatever leader you want. And these jokes have existed since the beginning of time. So for example, there was a joke under Alexander III in Russia. And the guy was arrested for calling Alexander an idiot. He was in the town square and someone heard him say Alexander was an idiot, and they take him to court. And the defense attorney says, he wasn't talking about the czar, of course. He was talking about his friend. And the judge says, when you're talking about an idiot in Russia, there's nobody else you could be talking about except the czar. And so these kind of jokes, with their internal contradictions and their irony, are actually useful because these jokes that come out of totalitarian states are basically cynical in the sense that they acknowledge that there's something going on that everybody knows about and doesn't talk about. There were other variations in the Soviet Union. We pretend to work and they pretend to pay us. Capitalism is man exploits man. In communism, it's exactly the opposite. And so these kind of jokes have always existed. And then you get to a point in society and development, where it's okay, especially in Western societies. The first loosening of the bolts, so to speak, was when you could begin to be quote unquote blasphemous, right? Where you could make fun of God or Jesus without facing charges, ecclesiastical charges, or eventually secular / ecclesiastical charges. In Western society, it would be very rare for you to suffer any kind of significant consequence for taking the pot shot at Christianity. That's changed, of course, in the United States to some degree because of reactionary evangelical sentiments. But at the same time, it's not a huge issue. And so that's one of the topics that you can get away with. But what's happening in stand-up right now is I would say, rather tedious and tiresome, which is a kind of a justification of the acceleration of challenging yourself upwards to reach some kind of place where you've crossed some kind of imaginary line. But if you look at it across the board, one of the things about discussions around wokeness, discussions around identity politics, discussions around what you say and can't say are completely arbitrary. As always, your power is of some significance. Some people can get away with same things. Some people cannot get away with same things. The only joke Jimmy Carr has significantly got in trouble for, and I support the outrage, was a joke he did about saying that amongst the others, including the 4 million Jews that were killed in the Shoah, that there were 1 million Roma killed. And I mean, as soon as I heard the setup of the joke, I knew where he was going to go, right? And I could guess it. And that's the trouble with a lot of these kind of jokes, is they're often just hacky puns or obvious. So I mean, I'm not gonna say the joke word for word. And in this particular case, it's also referring to the genocide of a people, not in the abstract, but in a very, very direct way. I would say not a sincere way, because I would say in his amorality, Jimmy Carr has no opinion on the Roma and probably has not spent enough time looking at the history of the Roma, nor is he probably impacted enough by, Roma in his own neighborhood that it contains a bit of personal anger and animosity. I mean, I just think that he is basically a guy with very little empathy and no feelings. And then on the Saudi Arabian front, Bill Burr, the comedian, who has come some way towards being a bit more progressive, in his ideas, just a kind of Joe Rogan-y type guy, was doing pretty well, in terms of developing a popular audience across all political ideals. And then he went to Saudi Arabia. And once again, you will see, and I know a lot of these comics, people that I like and appreciate and that are artists, and I just have to say fundamentally, even though it's not in good taste, they're just not well read and they're just not well educated. And when I go on the road, rarely do I see any of these comics reading the New York Times or reading a newspaper or going into anything in any depth. And I think that's why people like Lenny Bruce and Mortzall back in the day were better at it and stronger comics. And of course, Lenny Bruce was tormented and terrorized his entire life. Newsweek magazine say Lenny Bruce died not of an overdose of heroin, but of an overdose of police. And we've certainly moved away from police showing up at shows and shutting them down. But it has happened. My friends, McLean and McLean, the 1970s folk music group, were constantly taunted by the police charges and took their case to the Supreme Court, where they won. Gary and McLean from Winnipeg were instrumental in the free speech debate because they do a yeah.
We're cutting out a little bit, so we're just going to
Oh,
shift over.
yeah,
To
we're going to
do
shift
the-
to, we're
yeah,
cutting out
yeah.
as I talked about McLean and McLean.
We're just going to shift over here.
Oh, okay. McLean and McLean appear in a Ontario courtroom where they've done a song about the new released Star Wars, full of Star Wars references. And it is clear that the arresting officer has no idea what Star Wars is, and so has missed and misinterpreted every single reference in this rather benign song and looks like a horse's ass in court. Then the head detective who was involved in the investigation is asked if he knows what satire is. And satire, of course, as you know, which is taking something that's happening and exaggerating it for ironic and comedic effect. Tom Lehrer said that political satire died the day Henry Kissinger won the Nobel Peace Prize. And, that was the job of satire, was to take things and exaggerate them. But satire is essentially dead now because you can't anticipate something more ridiculous than what's going on a daily basis. In a general sense, I think I can reassure you in some ways that nothing terribly sinister is going on in terms of people being able to tell jokes. But at the same time, I don't like what's happening in comedy. I think it's been too commercialized. I think that too many people have too much of a platform. And when you get to the stage of people, former wrestlers who were never good comics to begin with, like Joe Rogan, having an enormous platform, unlike Mark Maron's What the Fuck, that I think, sort of skewed slightly to the left, and won a huge coup when he landed Obama. I think that Joe Rogan and some of these other comedy podcasts are not comedic at all. They display the tendencies that are also very common in stand-up comic personalities, which are a distrust of authority, closely rising to the point of paranoia, persecution complexes, usually troubled childhoods, and drugs and alcohol issues. And so one of the things you also have to take into account, and when you're talking about comedians, is this personality type, that it can often inform what comics choose or don't choose to do on stage. One of the first lessons I learned in producing a comedy festival is if you want a comedian to do something on stage that you don't want them to do, tell them not to do it. Because you're just reminding them of something they might have forgotten to do. So if you say, "Don't do that joke about," "Oh, I forgot that," and then they'll do the joke, and so you just kind of hopefully protect them from that. And I mean, something that I live by, and every intelligent comic I know lives by, is I think of the most disgraceful and disgusting, horrible jokes in my mind because I'm funny every day. And some of them I will share with friends, and some of them I will keep to myself. But I have no desire to try out or play brinksmanship every time I go on stage, right? It's just not worth it. Oftentimes jokes are good, but people are not going to understand the context of them, and so I'm pretty careful. And I've never gotten in any meaningful or significant trouble. But At the same time, I am very sensitive to people expressing harm at the comment I made. I think my best example would be I did a joke on the first Winnipeg Comedy Festival gala, and I think I already told them when I did the show I didn't want it in the show because it was local. But when I first transitioned, I had just moved from Sargent and Furby. It was pretty rough, very rough neighborhood at the time. But I took the 15 bus, that goes to Walmart. And if you've been on the 15, I mean, the main joke about the 15, and the joke I was going for, and my joke was that, people go to Walmart when it was open 24 hours, pretty much in their pajamas, right? And so nobody's dressing up often to go to Walmart on the 15th. But the joke was that it was about my sense of attractiveness, in public, post-transition. And I would say, and I don't find it attractive, this or that, except on the number 15 bus, where I'm a very, 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 very beautiful woman, right? And it was just based on the idea that nobody looks their best on the 15. And so I did the joke, as I said, and it got a huge laugh. And then I said, on the 15, I'm a 10. That was a little tag, I remember. And it got a huge laugh and applause break. And I said, don't have it in the TV show. Thank you. And for laughing. And then they had it on the radio when Tracy Wright out because they make a different cut, put it in the radio version. And then I phoned her and asked her to take it out the next time because I thought people wouldn't understand the context. And then I explained what the other context would be that I was concerned about, that I was being classist or racialized or, any of these kind of things, that there was kind of poor shaming going on. And she said, oh, no, no, no. I thought it was completely a self-deprecating joke. And, it wasn't completely a self-deprecating joke. I mean, it was to some degree self-deprecating, but obviously the victim of the joke were the other people on the bus that I imagine weren't as attractive as me. And obviously enough people understood the context to laugh uproariously. But on it appearing, and then Brad Fraser, in his roundup of the comedy festival, took the joke completely out of context and called it the best joke of the festival. And then, of course, I got tons of letters from people completely misunderstanding the joke. Also, on the other side of doing the joke, whether it's a mitigation or not, I apologize for the joke. I say it's horrible, and and the audience is clearly on side with my own struggles with the joke. And you will often see a comic who's said something horrible and out of sorts in a show if you watch the entire context of the show. It just happens they're killing, they're throwing out stuff that's a bit, on the right on the line, and the crowd's eating it up. And then even then they will say, no, no, don't. It just encourages me, right? And I think down on the other side of jokes that aren't obscenely racist or clearly wrong, that context is also very, very important, and we don't see that very often. But I got letters from people in the free press who misunderstood the context, and I just left those alone, and they died their own death. But somebody phoned CBC and then sent an email, a one-page email to me, explaining why the joke was really hurt. She felt hurtful, and as a fan, she didn't think it was in my style. And I do something that I just do. I've done it my whole life. Is I contact anybody that writes me about something they don't like, in an article and a news story and a joke. I will phone them and I'll have a conversation with them, and I'll apologize, for harming somebody or hurting their feelings. And then I will listen to clearly why they think the joke is what it is, and I'll push back if I think they're misunderstanding. And in this case, I talked to her for an hour and a half. And at the end of the hour and a half, I had to concede that despite all my mitigations, you could not run away from it being a classist joke. And there's enough classism in the city that I just said, and I told her, I said, I will never do the joke again. And she was extremely taken aback and, sent me a very effusive letter afterwards, saying, oh, no, you don't have to not do the, I said, no, this is what I'm going to do. And I never told the joke again. And Mark Maron talks about this all the time. You retire jokes, right? For a bunch of reasons. Sometimes they get old. Sometimes the politics change. Sometimes you change, but that expression, hill to die on. If there's a hill, a comic will die on it. That's the kind of personalities we have. And so often it's hubris and being hoisted by your own petard because the comic will just not stop defending themselves. And if they just apologize quickly and moved on, it would be much less of a scandal.